It was a quiet summer morning in the suburban town of Meadowbrook, where the Parker family lived a modest but happy life. Ethan Parker, a hard-working construction foreman, had just left for work. Grace Parker, a dedicated nurse, was making breakfast for their 10-year-old daughter, Lily. The smell of pancakes filled the cozy kitchen as Lily sat at the table, scribbling in her journal, a habit she'd picked up to document her observations about the world around her. "Lily, honey, eat up or you'll be late for school," Grace said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of her. "Okay, Mom," Lily replied, biting her lip as she doodled a picture of her family. Life seemed perfect in that moment, simple, peaceful, and predictable. But that tranquility shattered when a loud knock echoed from the front door. Grace frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Who could that be so early? When she opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions grim. "Mrs. Parker?" one of them asked. "Yes, that's me," Grace replied, her voice uncertain. "We have a warrant for Ethan Parker's arrest," the officer said, holding up a document. "He's being charged with assault and battery." Grace's heart stopped. There must be some mistake. Ethan would never hurt anyone. Lily appeared in the hallway, clutching her journal. "Mom? What's happening?" Before Grace could respond, she saw Ethan being escorted out of a police car parked in their driveway. He was in handcuffs, his face pale and confused. "Grace, I don't know what's going on," Ethan said as the officers led him toward the house. The officer explained that Ethan was suspected of attacking their neighbor, Mr. Doyle, who had been found unconscious in his home the night before. Fingerprints matching Ethan's were discovered on a broken window, and his wallet had been found near the scene. Grace protested, her voice rising in panic. "There's no way Ethan did this. You've got the wrong man." But the officers were firm, explaining that the evidence was compelling enough to make an arrest. Ethan was placed in the back of the patrol car, and Grace and Lily stood frozen in disbelief as it drove away. The hours after Ethan's arrest were a blur of phone calls and unanswered questions. Grace tried to contact a lawyer while Lily sat silently in her room, clutching her stuffed rabbit and staring at her journal. At school the next day, Lily overheard whispers from her classmates. "Did you hear? Lily's dad got arrested," one girl said. "My mom says he's dangerous," another boy added. Lily clenched her fists but stayed silent. She knew her father was innocent, and the thought of anyone believing otherwise made her stomach churn. In the following days, Grace struggled to hold the family together. Ethan was denied bail, and his first court appearance was scheduled for the next week. The Parker home, once filled with laughter, now felt empty and tense. Lily began to notice things others seemed to miss. She overheard her mom talking to Ethan's lawyer, Mr. Rowland, about discrepancies in the timeline of the evidence. She watched their neighbor, Mr. Holloway, acting nervous whenever the police visited Mr. Doyle's house. Lily's instincts told her something wasn't right. Her dad couldn't have done this, and she decided she had to prove it. On the day of Ethan's first court hearing, Grace reluctantly allowed Lily to attend. She didn't want her daughter to see her father in such a heartbreaking situation, but Lily was insistent. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge entered, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor presented their case, highlighting the evidence: Ethan's fingerprints, the wallet, and a witness who claimed to have seen someone resembling Ethan near Mr. Doyle's house that night. Lily sat quietly in the gallery, clutching her journal. Her eyes darted between the prosecutor and the witness, noting every detail. When the prosecutor mentioned the timeline of events, Lily's ears perked up. "That doesn't make sense," she whispered to herself, flipping through her journal. As the hearing continued, Lily felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to speak up, but what could she say? She was just a kid. But when a recess was called, Lily saw her chance. She tugged on Mr. Rowland's sleeve, her voice trembling but determined. "I think there's something wrong with what the witness said. Can I talk to the judge?" Rowland hesitated, looking at Grace, who shook her head. "She's just a child," Grace said softly. "No, Mom," Lily said firmly. "I know something. Please, let me try." Grace hesitated but nodded, her fear for her daughter outweighed by the desperation to clear her husband's name. When the recess ended, Lily took the witness stand, clutching her stuffed rabbit for comfort. The courtroom fell silent as the judge addressed her. "Young lady, do you understand the seriousness of being on this stand?" the judge asked gently. "Yes, Your Honor," Lily replied, her voice small but steady. Lily recounted the timeline discrepancies she had noticed and her observations about Mr. Holloway's behavior. She claimed he had been near Mr. Doyle's house multiple times before the attack. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and the prosecutor objected, calling her testimony speculative. The judge raised his hand. "We'll allow this line of questioning. Continue, Miss Parker." Lily took a deep breath and said, "My dad didn't do it, but I think I know who did." The room erupted in gasps, and the chapter ends with the judge calling for order, leaving everyone eager to hear what Lily would say next. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as Lily sat on the witness stand, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. Her small, determined voice had already shocked the entire room, but everyone was hanging on her next words. "Lily," Judge Whitman said kindly but firmly, "you just said you believe someone else may be responsible for the attack on Mr. Doyle. Can you explain what you mean?" Lily nodded, her heart pounding. She had never spoken in front of so many people before, but the thought of her father sitting in jail gave her courage. "I saw Mr. Holloway, my teacher, acting really weird around Mr. Doyle's house," she said. "He's been visiting there a lot lately. And the night before my dad was arrested, I saw him near Mr. Doyle's window." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation from a child." Judge Whitman banged his gavel. "Overruled. Miss Parker's observations are relevant given the circumstances. Proceed." The prosecutor reluctantly sat down, his face tight with irritation. Lily continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Mr. Holloway said he was there to help Mr. Doyle with his garden. But he doesn't even like Mr. Doyle. He said so at school. He told another teacher that Mr. Doyle owed him something." The defense attorney, Mr. Rowland, stood and addressed Lily. "Thank you for sharing this, Lily. Can you tell us exactly what you saw that night?" Lily took a deep breath. "I saw Mr. Holloway carrying something in a bag, and he looked really angry. I didn't think much about it then, but now I think he was up to something." The courtroom buzzed as the judge called for a brief recess to evaluate Lily's claims. Grace rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her into a tight hug. "Lily, that was so brave," she whispered. "But I hope you're not in trouble for saying all that." "I had to, Mom," Lily replied. "I know Dad didn't do it, and if Mr. Holloway is involved, someone has to say it." As the hearing resumed, Mr. Rowland requested an official inquiry into Mr. Holloway's connection to Mr. Doyle. The judge, noting the seriousness of the accusations, granted the request. Detectives were ordered to question Mr. Holloway and revisit the evidence with this new information. But the prosecutor was not about to let Ethan off the hook so easily. He presented more evidence: Ethan's fingerprints on Mr. Doyle's broken window, his wallet found near the crime scene, and a neighbor who claimed to have seen Ethan leaving Mr. Doyle's house on the night of the attack. Ethan, sitting at the defendant's table, looked heartbroken. He turned toward Grace and Lily, mouthing the words, "I didn't do it." Later that day, detectives visited Mr. Holloway at the school where he worked. When questioned, Holloway denied any involvement with the attack. "I was at Mr. Doyle's house earlier that week," Holloway admitted, "but only to discuss his late payments for a tutoring program I helped set up for him." The detectives pressed further. "What about the night of the attack? Can anyone confirm your whereabouts?" Holloway hesitated. "I was home grading papers," he said, his voice faltering. The detectives weren't convinced. They asked to see the bag Lily mentioned, but Holloway claimed it had been discarded long ago. Back at the Parker house, Grace was preparing dinner when her phone rang. She answered cautiously, fearing more bad news. It was Detective Marshall. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "we've completed our initial questioning of Mr. Holloway. He denies any involvement, but we'll keep him under surveillance for now. Unfortunately, we don't have enough evidence to pursue charges against him." Grace's heart sank. "So what happens next?" "For now, Ethan's case proceeds as planned," Marshall said. "But we're also exploring a new lead. A former associate of Mr. Doyle's, Marcus Crane, has come up in our investigation. He has a criminal record, and we've learned he was recently seen near Mr. Doyle's property." Grace's grip on the phone tightened. What does this mean for Ethan? It's too early to say, Marshall replied, but we'll be in touch. That night, as Grace tucked Lily into bed, she noticed her daughter's furrowed brow. Are you okay, sweetheart? Grace asked. I don't trust Mr. Holloway, Lily said. And who's Marcus Crane? Why would he be at Mr. Doyle's house? I don't know, honey, Grace said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. But the police are working hard to figure it out. And so are we. Lily nodded, but her mind was racing. She grabbed her journal after her mom left and started writing down everything she could remember about Mr. Holloway, the courtroom, and the mention of Marcus Crane. The next morning, a knock at the door startled the Parkers. Grace opened it to find Detective Marshall standing there, his face grim. Mrs. Parker, Lily, he said, I'm afraid we have some bad news. Marcus Crane fled his residence last night. He's officially a fugitive. Grace's face paled. What does that mean for us? Marshall hesitated. We're not sure yet, but we've stationed patrol cars in the neighborhood, just in case. Lily stepped forward, her voice steady. If Marcus is running, doesn't that mean he has something to hide? Marshall gave her a small, sad smile. It does, Lily, but don't worry. We'll find him. As the day wore on, the Parkers noticed a growing unease in their normally quiet neighborhood. Patrol cars cruised past every hour, and neighbors avoided eye contact. Lily felt the weight of it all, but refused to give in to fear. She sat on the porch that evening, staring at the sunset, her journal open on her lap. Suddenly, her eyes landed on a small mark scratched into the wooden railing. What's this? She muttered, running her finger over it. It was a strange symbol, almost like a riddle. Lily's heart raced as she realized it hadn't been there before. Mom, she called. Grace rushed outside, and Lily showed her the mark. Do you think this has something to do with Marcus? Grace frowned. I don't know, but we're calling Detective Marshall. The chapter ends with Marshall arriving to inspect the strange mark, his expression darkening as he studies it. This symbol, he says quietly, is a warning. Marcus Crane knows exactly where you are. The Parker household was cloaked in a tense silence after Detective Marshall's chilling words. This symbol is a warning. Marcus Crane knows exactly where you are. Grace sat on the edge of the couch, her hands gripping the armrest tightly. Lily sat next to her, clutching her stuffed rabbit and her journal, her wide eyes darting nervously between her mother and the detective. What does this mean for my family? Grace finally asked, her voice trembling. It means Marcus Crane is desperate, Marshall replied. When people like him feel cornered, they tend to lash out. But I promise we'll do everything we can to protect you. Grace looked unconvinced. Protect us how? He already knows where we live. We've increased patrols in the area, Marshall assured her. And I'll personally make sure an officer is stationed outside your house at all times. But for now, I need you to stay vigilant. Don't let anyone inside the house, and don't go anywhere alone. Lily, though young, understood the seriousness of the situation. She scribbled notes into her journal, determined to figure out why Marcus was targeting her family. Her mind kept circling back to the strange symbol etched into their porch railing. What could it mean? That night, as the family tried to settle down, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Grace checked every lock on every door and window at least 3 times, and Lily stayed close to her mother's side. Mom, what if he's not just trying to scare us? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace forced a reassuring smile. The police are here to protect us, sweetheart. Try not to worry. But worry was all Lily could do. She lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, the shadows on the walls twisting into ominous shapes. Every creak of the house made her heart race. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly and whispered to herself, We'll figure this out. We have to. The next morning, the news was grim. Detective Marshall called to inform Grace that Marcus Crane's abandoned car had been found on the outskirts of town. Inside, police discovered a burner phone, a stack of cash, and a map with several addresses circled. One of those addresses was the Parker's home. Do you think he's planning to come here? Grace asked over the phone, her voice shaking. It's hard to say, Marshall admitted, but it's clear your family is connected to whatever he's running from. We're looking into those other addresses now to see if they hold any clues. Meanwhile, Lily's curiosity burned brighter than ever. She spent the afternoon flipping through her journal, writing down everything she could remember about Marcus Crane. "What do we know about him?" she muttered to herself. "Why would he care about us? And what does that symbol mean?" Her thoughts drifted back to the courtroom and her testimony about Mr. Holloway. Could he and Marcus be working together? She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. That evening, as the family tried to have a normal dinner, a loud knock startled them. Grace froze, the fork slipping from her hand. "Stay here," she whispered to Lily, standing up slowly. Peeking through the peephole, Grace saw a delivery driver holding a package. She let out a sigh of relief and opened the door. "Delivery for Grace Parker?" the man asked. "Yes, that's me," Grace replied, accepting the package. But as she closed the door, she noticed there was no return address. Grace placed the package on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might explode. "Who's it from, Mom?" Lily asked, her curiosity piqued. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "It doesn't say." Lily leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Maybe it's a clue." Grace hesitated, then carefully opened the package. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small metal object, a key. The paper had one sentence written on it. "The truth lies beneath." "What does that mean?" Grace whispered. Lily picked up the key, turning it over in her hands. It was old and slightly rusted, with no markings to indicate what it might unlock. "It's a key to something important," Lily said confidently. "We just have to figure out what." Detective Marshall arrived shortly after to examine the package. He studied the key and the note with a furrowed brow. "This could be from Marcus," he said, "or someone else who knows what's going on. Either way, we need to be careful." "Do you recognize the key?" Lily asked. Marshall shook his head. "Not yet, but we'll run it through our records. Maybe it matches something from the crime scenes." As the detective left, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the key was meant for her family. She decided to dig deeper, determined to find out what "the truth lies beneath" really meant. The next day, Marcus Crane made headlines again. He had broken into a storage facility on the other side of town, but by the time police arrived, he was gone. Surveillance footage showed Marcus carrying a large bag out of one of the units. "Do you think it's connected to us?" Lily asked Grace as they watched the news. "I don't know," Grace replied, her voice heavy with worry. But Lily had a theory. She remembered hearing Mr. Holloway mention something about hidden valuables during one of his visits to Mr. Doyle's house. What if Marcus had taken something from the storage unit that could prove her father's innocence? That night, another cryptic message appeared. This time, it was slipped under their front door. "You're closer than you think." Grace immediately called Detective Marshall, who arrived with a team to sweep the house. But once again, there were no fingerprints or evidence to trace the source of the note. "This is getting out of hand," Grace said, her voice filled with frustration. "I know," Marshall replied, "but we're closing in on Marcus. He won't stay hidden for long." Lily listened quietly, her mind racing. She couldn't just sit and wait for the police to figure it out. She had to act. Later that night, Lily grabbed her journal and wrote down her plan. The key, the symbol, and the cryptic notes all pointed to something hidden, something that could change everything. She didn't know exactly where to look, but she had an idea. Mr. Doyle's backyard. It had always felt like the center of this mystery. The chapter ends with Lily staring out her bedroom window, clutching the old key. "The truth lies beneath," she whispered to herself, "and I'm going to find it." The warm afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mr. Doyle's backyard as Lily stood near the edge of the fence, clutching the old key in one hand and her stuffed rabbit in the other. Her mom, Grace, stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, eyes darting around nervously. "Lily, I don't like this," Grace said. "We should wait for Detective Marshall." "We've already called him," Lily replied, her voice steady. "But what if Marcus comes back before they get here? What if this is our only chance to find out the truth?" Grace sighed, glancing at the overgrown garden and the broken security camera mounted on the side of Mr. Doyle's house. The place had been eerily quiet since the attack. "Fine," Grace said reluctantly, "but we stay together, and we don't touch anything until Marshall arrives." Lily scanned the yard, her sharp eyes catching something unusual near the back corner. a patch of dirt that looked disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up. She pointed toward it. "Over there," she said, tugging at her mom's sleeve. Grace followed her, her breath quickening as they approached. Sure enough, the dirt was loose, and a few small stones were scattered across the surface. "This has to be it," Lily whispered, kneeling down. Grace hesitated, but before she could protest, Lily began digging with her hands, dirt collecting under her fingernails. "Lily, stop," Grace said, kneeling beside her. "Let me help." Together, they unearthed a small metal box, its surface rusted and dented from years underground. "It's locked," Grace said, examining it. Lily's heart raced as she held up the old key. "Let's see if this works." The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. Lily and Grace exchanged a tense glance before Lily lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash, their edges worn and faded. But it wasn't the money that caught Lily's attention. It was the small leather-bound notebook resting on top. Lily picked it up, her fingers trembling. The cover was embossed with the initials MD, Mr. Doyle's. "What is it?" Grace asked. "It's a ledger," Lily said, flipping through the pages. Each page was filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts, along with cryptic notes like Holloway, late payment, and Crane, supplies delivered. "Mom, look," Lily said, pointing to an entry near the end. The note read, "Shaw, final installment. Close the account." "Shaw," Grace said, frowning. "Isn't that Alexandra Shaw? She runs that charity downtown. Why would Mr. Doyle be writing about her in a ledger?" Lily asked. Before Grace could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. "Get back," Grace whispered, pulling Lily behind her. Detective Marshall emerged from the side gate, followed by two officers. He raised his hands in a calming gesture. "It's just us," Marshall said. "What did you find?" Grace stepped aside, revealing the open box and the ledger in Lily's hands. Marshall crouched down, his expression shifting from curiosity to grim understanding as he examined the contents. "This is big," he muttered. "We need to get this back to the station immediately." "What does it mean?" Lily asked. Marshall looked at her, his eyes serious. "It means Mr. Doyle was involved in something much bigger than we thought. And if this ledger is what I think it is, it could implicate more people than just Marcus Crane." Back at the station, the ledger was placed in evidence, and Marshall and his team began analyzing its contents. Lily and Grace waited in a small room, the minutes dragging on like hours. Finally, Marshall returned, holding a photocopy of one of the ledger's pages. "You were right," he said, sitting down across from them. "This ledger is a record of illegal transactions, embezzlement, blackmail, and payoffs. It ties Marcus Crane, Mr. Doyle, and—" he paused, tapping the page. "Alexandra Shaw directly together." Grace gasped. "Shaw? She's been helping us since Ethan's arrest. Are you saying she's involved?" "It looks that way," Marshall said. "Doyle was keeping a record of payments she made to him and Marcus. And this entry," he pointed to one that read, "Holloway, package delivered, suggests Mr. Holloway isn't as innocent as he claims." Lily leaned forward. "So does this prove my dad's innocent?" "It's a step in the right direction," Marshall said. "But we need more to clear Ethan's name completely. This ledger connects a lot of people to criminal activity, but we have to prove how it ties to the attack on Mr. Doyle." As night fell, the weight of what they'd uncovered hung heavy over the Parkers. Grace sat on the couch, staring at the photocopy Marshall had left behind. "I can't believe it," she muttered. "Alexandra Shaw. She's been in our home, comforting us, pretending to care." Lily sat beside her, flipping through her journal. "Do you think she'll try to stop us now that we found the ledger?" Grace's face tightened. "If she's as dangerous as this makes her seem, we need to be very careful." Meanwhile, at a lavish mansion on the edge of town, Alexandra Shaw poured herself a glass of wine, her expression cool and composed as she spoke into the phone. "They found the ledger," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Yes, I know. It was only a matter of time." The voice on the other end replied, indistinct but urgent. "No, I'm not worried," Alexandra said with a smirk. "If anything, this just makes things more interesting." She ended the call and stared out the window, her eyes narrowing. "It's time to tie up loose ends," she murmured. The Parker household was quiet the next morning, but the tension was palpable. Grace hadn't slept, her mind racing after learning that Alexandra Shaw, a woman who had seemed like an ally, was potentially behind the web of lies that had ensnared Ethan. Lily sat at the kitchen table with her journal, writing down everything she could remember about Alexandra's visits and conversations. "She always brought cookies," Lily said aloud, more to herself than her mother. "She made it seem like she cared. But if she's behind this, why would she help us?" "Because she wanted to keep us close," Grace said, her voice tight with anger. "She probably thought if we trusted her, we wouldn't look too closely at her involvement." Detective Marshall arrived later that day, his expression grim. "Alexandra Shaw is now officially under investigation," he said, setting a file on the table. "But she's not someone who's going to go down easily. She's well-connected and knows how to cover her tracks." Grace looked over the documents he brought. "What do you mean by well-connected?" "Shaw runs a successful charity," Marshall explained, "but it's mostly a front for laundering money. The ledger proves she was funneling funds through Mr. Doyle and Marcus Crane. But what's more alarming is her connection to Robert Langley." "Who's Robert Langley?" Lily asked, leaning forward. "A former employee of Doyle's," Marshall said. "He's been off the grid for years, but we believe he was working for Shaw as an enforcer. If Langley's involved, this conspiracy goes deeper than we thought." As Marshall continued explaining the scope of Alexandra's network, Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. "It's her," Grace whispered. Marshall's eyes narrowed. "Put it on speaker. Let's hear what she has to say." Grace answered, her voice shaking slightly. "Hello?" "Grace," Alexandra's warm, familiar voice came through the line. "I just wanted to check in on you and Lily. I heard about the police activity at Doyle's house. Is everything okay?" Grace swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "We're fine. Just trying to get through all this." "I'm so sorry you're still dealing with this nightmare," Alexandra said, her tone laced with false sympathy. "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." Grace hesitated, then replied, "Thank you, Alexandra. I'll let you know if we need anything." When the call ended, Marshall shook his head. "She's fishing. She knows the police are onto her, and she's trying to find out how much we know." That evening, Marshall advised Grace and Lily to avoid any further contact with Alexandra while he worked to build a stronger case against her. Meanwhile, at her mansion, Alexandra wasn't sitting idly. She made another call, this time to Robert Langley. "They've got the ledger," she said, her voice low and sharp. "And they're sniffing around. I need you to clean this up." Langley's voice was gruff on the other end. "What do you want me to do?" "Doyle's ledger ties everything back to us," Alexandra said. "But there's a second ledger, and they don't know about it yet. It's still in the old office building. Get it before they do." "And if they get in the way?" Langley asked. "Make sure they don't," Alexandra replied coldly. The next day, Grace received another unexpected phone call, this time from Mr. Doyle himself. "I heard you found my ledger," he said, his voice weak and hoarse. "I don't know how much you've seen, but you need to be careful. Alexandra doesn't play games." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "Why did you keep that ledger in the first place?" "I didn't have a choice," Doyle admitted. "Alexandra forced me into it. She threatened me and my family. That ledger was my insurance policy in case she ever turned on me." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Grace asked. "Because I knew she'd destroy me if I did," Doyle said. "But now, with the police involved, she's more dangerous than ever." Detective Marshall soon received intelligence that Langley had been spotted near the abandoned office building where Alexandra had conducted some of her operations. Believing Langley might be after more evidence, Marshall organized a team to intercept him. Grace insisted on coming along, but Marshall was firm. "It's too dangerous," he said. "Langley isn't just some petty thief. He's violent, and he knows we're closing in. Stay home and keep Lily safe." That night, Grace tried to distract herself by helping Lily with her schoolwork, but her mind kept drifting to the dangers lurking outside their door. Lily, ever observant, noticed her mother's worry and decided to take matters into her own hands. While Grace was on the phone with a relative, Lily quietly grabbed her journal and stuffed rabbit. She had overheard enough to know where the office building was, and she felt like it was her responsibility to help. If Langley finds that second ledger, everything could be ruined, Lily whispered to herself as she slipped out the front door. At the abandoned office building, Langley was already inside, tearing through old desks and filing cabinets. He found a hidden compartment in one of the walls and pried it open, revealing a small metal box. "Gotcha," he muttered, pulling it out. As he turned to leave, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Spinning around, he spotted Lily peeking through the doorway. "What are you doing here?" Langley barked, his eyes narrowing. Lily froze, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I just want to help my dad," she stammered. Langley sneered. "You've got guts, kid, but you shouldn't have come here." Before Langley could make another move, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Flashlights flooded the building as officers surrounded him. Detective Marshall stormed in, his gun drawn. "Langley, drop the box and put your hands up." Langley hesitated but eventually complied, realizing he was outnumbered. The police arrested him and secured the box he had taken from the hidden compartment. Marshall spotted Lily, and his expression turned stern. "Lily, what are you doing here?" "I had to help," Lily said, her voice small. "I knew he'd try to take something important." Marshall sighed, kneeling to her level. "You're lucky we got here in time, but you can't take risks like this, no matter how brave you are." As Langley was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back at Lily. "You think you're safe now," he said with a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what's coming." Lily shivered at his words, but stood her ground. "We'll stop her," she said quietly. The chapter ends with Marshall examining the contents of the box Langley had retrieved. Inside is a second ledger, even more damning than the first, containing detailed plans for Alexandra's future operations. "This changes everything," Marshall said, his voice filled with determination. The tension in the air was thick as Detective Marshall placed the second ledger on the table back at the police station. Grace and Lily sat on one side of the room, while Marshall flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every turn. "This ledger doesn't just implicate Alexandra Shaw," he said finally. "It's a blueprint for her entire operation: money laundering, blackmail, even plans to silence people who got too close to the truth." Grace's face paled. "Silence them? You mean, like what happened to Mr. Doyle?" Marshall nodded grimly. "Exactly. Langley was one of her enforcers, but Shaw's reach goes beyond him. She has more people working for her, and we're only starting to uncover how deep this goes." "What happens now?" Grace asked, gripping Lily's hand tightly. "Langley's our best chance at bringing Shaw down," Marshall replied. "But getting him to talk won't be easy. He's loyal to her, or at least he's afraid of what she'll do if he betrays her." Later that day, Marshall sat across from Langley in an interrogation room. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek, a physical reminder of the dangerous life he'd lived. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, exuding defiance. "You think locking me up changes anything?" Langley sneered. "Shaw's untouchable. You'll never pin this on her." Marshall leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "We have 2 ledgers and evidence tying you directly to multiple crimes. If you cooperate, we can work out a deal. But if you protect her, you're going down for everything." Langley scoffed. "You think I'm afraid of prison? Shaw's more dangerous than any cell you could put me in." Marshall's patience was wearing thin. He slid photos across the table, images of Mr. Doyle, battered and unconscious in his hospital bed, alongside pages from the ledger with Langley's name highlighted. "Tell me something," Marshall said. "Was it worth it? Hurting people, destroying lives, just to protect someone who wouldn't think twice about throwing you under the bus?" Langley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, Lily and Grace waited anxiously in another room. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit, her mind racing with questions. "What if he doesn't talk, Mom?" she asked. "What if Shaw gets away with everything?" Grace placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Detective Marshall knows what he's doing. He'll get Langley to crack." But Lily wasn't so sure. She remembered the way Langley had looked at her during the raid at the office building. His eyes had been full of something more than defiance. Fear. Lily flipped open her journal and began writing, piecing together everything she knew about Langley. As she wrote, a thought struck her. "Mom," she said suddenly, "what if Langley's afraid because Shaw has something on him, like she had on Mr. Doyle?" Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" "Shaw blackmailed Doyle, right? What if she's blackmailing Langley too? If we can figure out what she's holding over him, maybe we can convince him to talk?" Inspired by Lily's theory, Marshall shifted tactics in the interrogation room. "You're afraid of her, aren't you?" he said, his tone softening. "Afraid of what she knows about you, what she might do if you betray her." Langley's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm Marshall's suspicions. "Whatever it is," Marshall continued, "we can help, but only if you help us." Langley hesitated, his tough exterior cracking. He looked down at the table, his hands clenching into fists. "She has dirt on everyone who works for her," he said finally, his voice low. "It's how she keeps control. For me, it's my family." Marshall leaned forward. "Your family?" Langley nodded. "My wife and son. She knows things about them, things I've done, that could ruin their lives. If I cross her, she'll make sure they suffer." With this revelation, Marshall knew he had leverage. "We can protect your family," he said. "We can make sure Sean never touches them. But you have to trust us. Tell us everything." Langley's shoulders slumped, and he exhaled heavily. "Okay," he said. "I'll tell you what you want to know." Langley's confession was explosive. He revealed that Alexandra Shaw had been laundering money through her charity for years, using her connections to manipulate powerful people. She targeted those who crossed her, like Mr. Doyle, and used people like Langley to do her dirty work. "She's planning something big," Langley said. "The ledgers are just the tip of the iceberg. She's been meeting with some powerful people, politicians, CEOs. If she goes down, a lot of them will go with her." "What's her next move?" Marshall asked. Langley hesitated. "There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow night at her mansion. She's bringing together her inner circle to figure out how to contain this." Marshall's jaw tightened. "We'll be ready." The next morning, as the police prepared to raid Alexandra Shaw's mansion, Marshall briefed Grace and Lily. "This is it," he said. "If we can catch her red-handed, we'll finally have enough to take her down for good." "Is it dangerous?" Grace asked, worry etched across her face. "It always is," Marshall admitted. "But we'll have backup. And with Langley's testimony, we have a solid case." Lily, sitting quietly at the table, looked up at Marshall. "Do you think she'll try to run?" "She might," Marshall said. "But we'll be ready for that too." That evening, the police surrounded Shaw's mansion, moving in silently under the cover of darkness. Inside, Alexandra sat at the head of a grand dining table, her inner circle gathered around her. "We have a problem," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "The police are closing in. Langley's betrayal has put us all at risk." One of the men at the table spoke up. "What do you want us to do?" "Whatever it takes to protect this operation," Alexandra replied. "Burn the files. Destroy the evidence. And if the Parkers or their detective friend get in the way, deal with them." Before anyone could respond, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the room as the police stormed in. "Freeze!" Marshall shouted, his gun drawn. Alexandra stood slowly, her calm demeanor unbroken. "Detective Marshall," she said with a sly smile. "How nice of you to join us." The chapter ends with Alexandra being handcuffed and led out of her mansion, her empire crumbling around her. But as she passes Marshall, she whispers something chilling. "You may have won this battle, detective, but the war is far from over." The night of the raid was a whirlwind. As Alexandra Shaw was escorted out of her mansion in handcuffs, cameras from news crews that had been tipped off captured the scene. The once revered philanthropist, known for her charity work, was now exposed as the mastermind behind a sprawling criminal empire. Detective Marshall stood at the perimeter, giving instructions to his team. "Search every room. Bag and tag everything. We need to ensure no stone is left unturned." Inside the mansion, officers uncovered documents, encrypted flash drives, and even hidden compartments filled with cash and incriminating evidence. The scale of Alexandra's operation was staggering. The next morning, the news dominated every television and social media feed. "Breaking: Local philanthropist Alexandra Shaw arrested in criminal conspiracy. Grace and Lily watched the broadcast from their living room, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over them. She fooled everyone, Grace said, shaking her head. The whole town trusted her, and she used that trust to hurt people. But now everyone knows the truth, Lily said. She can't hurt anyone else. Despite Alexandra's arrest, the battle was far from over. Her high-powered lawyer immediately went to work, filing motions to dismiss evidence and delay proceedings. Meanwhile, her inner circle of associates began distancing themselves, many claiming they were unaware of her criminal activities. Detective Marshall faced mounting pressure to solidify the case against Alexandra. The Ledgers and Langley's testimony were strong, but the defense's aggressive tactics meant nothing could be left to chance. "We need Doyle to testify," Marshall told Grace during a meeting. Grace frowned. "He's still recovering. Are you sure he's ready for this?" "He's the only one who can confirm Alexandra's direct involvement," Marshall said. "Without him, her lawyers will argue that she's being framed." A week later, Mr. Doyle appeared in court, leaning on a cane. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "Mr. Doyle," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court about your relationship with Alexandra Shaw?" Doyle took a deep breath. "She approached me about 10 years ago, offering financial support for my struggling construction business. At first, it seemed legitimate, just loans with fair terms. But over time, she started asking for favors in return. She wanted me to launder money through my business and keep records of her illegal dealings." "And did you comply?" the prosecutor asked. Doyle nodded. "I didn't have a choice. She threatened me, said she'd ruin me if I didn't cooperate. She even sent Robert Langley to intimidate me." The courtroom murmured as Doyle described how Alexandra's control tightened over the years. He recounted the night of the attack, explaining that Alexandra had grown paranoid about the ledgers falling into the wrong hands. "She sent Langley to retrieve them," Doyle said, his voice trembling. "When I refused, he attacked me. I'm lucky to be alive." During cross-examination, Alexandra's lawyer tried to discredit Doyle's testimony, suggesting he was lying to save himself. "Mr. Doyle, isn't it true that you've faced financial troubles in the past? Isn't it possible that you're exaggerating these claims to shift the blame onto my client?" Doyle's jaw tightened. "I made mistakes, but I'm telling the truth. Alexandra Shaw orchestrated everything." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Grace and Lily as they arrived to observe the trial. Cameras flashed as journalists shouted questions. "Mrs. Parker, how do you feel about Alexandra Shaw's arrest?" "Lily, what was it like to testify against someone so powerful?" Grace shielded Lily as they made their way inside, but Lily stopped to address the crowd. "I just want people to know that the truth matters," she said, her voice clear. "No matter how scary it is, standing up for what's right is always worth it." Inside the courtroom, Alexandra remained composed, her expression cold and unreadable. But her facade began to crack when Detective Marshall presented the second ledger as evidence. "This document," Marshall said, holding up a photocopy of a particularly damning page, "details direct payments from Alexandra Shaw's accounts to known enforcers, including Robert Langley and Marcus Cray. It also lists payments to influential figures in exchange for their silence." The prosecutor followed up by calling Langley to the stand. Though his cooperation was part of a plea deal, his testimony was devastating. "Shaw called all the shots," Langley said. "She made every decision, and anyone who crossed her paid the price. She even had plans to frame Ethan Parker for Doyle's attack when things went south." As the trial progressed, the mountain of evidence against Alexandra grew. The ledgers, Langley's testimony, and Mr. Doyle's account painted a clear picture of her criminal empire. But Alexandra's lawyer fought back, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that Langley and Doyle were unreliable witnesses. "This case relies on the word of criminals and the assumptions of investigators," the defense attorney said during closing arguments. "Where is the hard proof that my client orchestrated these crimes?" The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution delivered its rebuttal. "We have the hard proof," the prosecutor said. "It's in the ledgers, in the financial records, and in the testimonies of those who lived under Alexandra Shaw's control. The truth is clear. Alexandra Shaw is guilty." The jury deliberated for 2 days, leaving everyone on edge. Grace, Lily, and Ethan, who had been released on bail after the evidence against him was discredited, waited anxiously for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. In the case of the state versus Alexandra Shaw, we find the defendant guilty on all charges. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Alexandra's composure finally cracked as she was led away in handcuffs, her empire dismantled. Outside the courthouse, reporters once again swarmed the Parker family. "What's next for your family?" one journalist asked. Grace smiled, holding Lily close. "We're going to rebuild our lives, one step at a time. And we're going to keep standing up for what's right," Lily added, her eyes shining with determination. The Parker family stood together on the courthouse steps as the crowd of reporters gradually dispersed. For the first time in months, the weight of fear and uncertainty began to lift. Ethan took a deep breath, his hand resting on Lily's shoulder. "It's finally over," Ethan said, his voice filled with relief. Grace smiled gently, though the weariness of the past months lingered in her eyes. "Not completely, but this is a good start." Lily looked up at her father, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "We did it, Dad. We didn't give up." Ethan knelt down, pulling her into a tight hug. "No, we didn't. And that's because of you, Lily. You never stopped fighting for me." The days following Alexandra Shaw's conviction were filled with cautious optimism. Ethan's charges were officially dropped, and the media shifted its focus from the Parkers to the fallout of Shaw's empire. As more people were implicated in her crimes, the community began to reckon with how deeply her influence had reached. For the Parkers, however, the journey to normalcy was just beginning. Ethan decided to return to work at a local construction firm, though it wasn't easy. Many people still looked at him with suspicion, a reminder of how quickly trust could be lost. "Don't let it get to you," Grace told him one evening as they sat on the porch. "People will come around. They just need time." "I know," Ethan said, staring out at the quiet street. "But it's hard not to feel like this will follow me forever." Lily, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped outside. "It won't, Dad. We'll show them who you really are." Ethan smiled, reaching out to pull her into a hug. "You're my little fighter. You know that?" At school, Lily faced her own challenges. Some classmates were kind, treating her like a hero for standing up in court. Others were less forgiving, whispering behind her back about her family's ordeal. One afternoon during recess, a boy named Jack, who had avoided her for weeks, approached hesitantly. "Hey, Lily," he said, shuffling his feet. "Hi, Jack," Lily replied cautiously. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Jack said, his cheeks flushing, "for the way I treated you. My parents said I should stay away from you because of, but I know now that they were wrong. Your dad didn't do anything bad." Lily smiled. "Thanks, Jack. That means a lot." Jack hesitated, then added, "You were really brave, standing up in court like that. I don't think I could have done it." "You'd be surprised what you can do when it's for someone you love," Lily said. Jack grinned. "Well, if you ever need someone to sit with at lunch, I'm here." "Thanks," Lily said. "Friends?" "Friends," Jack agreed. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table for their first home-cooked meal together since Ethan's release. The room was filled with the smell of roasted chicken and laughter as Ethan recounted his attempts at learning chess while in jail. "Turns out I'm terrible at it," Ethan said, making Lily giggle. "But I did learn how to bake bread. Maybe I'll try making some for us." Grace smiled, her hand resting on his. "That's a deal, but no more jail stories tonight, okay?" Ethan chuckled. "Deal." As the conversation quieted, Ethan turned to Lily, his expression serious. "Lily, I don't know how to thank you for everything you did. You stood up for me when no one else did. You're the reason I'm here right now." Lily blushed, looking down at her plate. "I just wanted to help." "You did more than help," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved our family." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she hugged her dad tightly. "I missed you so much, Dad." "I missed you too, kiddo," Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. "And I promise I'll never let anything like this happen to us again." In the weeks that followed, the Parkers began to rebuild their lives. Grace returned to her nursing job, Ethan started volunteering with community projects, and Lily threw herself into her schoolwork and her journal, which had become a symbol of her courage and determination. The family also began discussing ways they could help others who had experienced injustice. "There are so many people who don't have the resources or support we had," Ethan said one evening as they sat together in the living room. "Maybe we could start something," Lily suggested, "like a group that helps people tell their stories." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "That's a wonderful idea. We could call it something meaningful, like the Brave Voices Foundation." Ethan smiled. "I love it. A way to turn everything we've been through into something good." Lily beamed. "Then let's do it." As the foundation took shape, the Parkers shared their story at schools, community centers, and local events. Lily became a symbol of resilience and hope, inspiring others to stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult. One evening, after a long day of meetings about the foundation, a letter arrived at the Parker home. There was no return address, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "The truth isn't always what it seems." Lily stared at the note, her stomach twisting. "What does it mean?" she asked. Grace frowned, her expression wary. "I don't know, but we're calling Detective Marshall." Ethan took the letter, his jaw tightening. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. We've been through worse." As the family gathered around the table, the mysterious letter sat between them, a reminder that while their battle for justice was over, the fight for the truth might not be. But they were ready, together. The mysterious letter lingered on the kitchen table, its presence like an unwelcome guest. Grace, Ethan, and Lily sat around it, the tension in the room palpable. The single line of text, "The truth isn't always what it seems," replayed in their minds. "Do you think it's from Alexandra Shaw?" Grace asked, her voice low. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's possible. Even from jail, she could still have people working for her. But why send a cryptic message like this?" Lily sat quietly, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Her mind raced with possibilities. The message didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a clue. "I think someone's trying to tell us something," Lily said finally. Grace looked at her daughter, worry etched on her face. "Lily, we've already been through so much. I don't want you getting caught up in this again." "But what if this is important?" Lily insisted. "What if we're missing something?" Detective Marshall arrived later that evening, his expression grave as he examined the letter. "No fingerprints, no markings, no return address," he said, holding it up to the light. "Whoever sent this wanted to stay anonymous." "Do you think it's a threat?" Grace asked. Marshall shook his head. "It doesn't read like one. If anything, it seems like a warning, or maybe even a clue." Ethan frowned. "But a clue to what? We already brought down Alexandra Shaw. What more could there be?" Marshall hesitated, then pulled out a folder. "There's one loose end we haven't tied up, Cameron Tate." "Who's Cameron Tate?" Lily asked. "A former business partner of Alexandra's," Marshall explained. "His name came up in the second ledger, but we haven't been able to track him down. He disappeared right after Shaw's arrest." "You think he sent the letter?" Ethan asked. "It's possible," Marshall said. "If he's hiding, he might be trying to send a message without exposing himself." The next day, the Parker family tried to return to normal life, but the letter remained a nagging thought in the back of their minds. Lily, unable to let it go, spent the evening flipping through her journal, jotting down notes and theories. "Cameron Tate," she whispered to herself. "What does he know?" Her thoughts drifted to the ledgers, the detailed records of Alexandra's crimes. What if there was something in them that everyone had missed? Inspired, Lily convinced her parents to ask Marshall for access to the ledgers. That afternoon, they met at the police station, where Marshall laid the documents out on a conference table. "What are we looking for?" Grace asked. "Anything that doesn't add up," Lily said, flipping through the pages. "A name, a date, a payment, something that could connect to Cameron Tate." Hours passed as they combed through the records. Just as fatigue began to set in, Lily's finger paused on a particular entry. "Here," she said, pointing to a payment labeled CT, security contract. Marshall leaned over to examine it. "That's Cameron Tate's initials. It's dated 3 days before Mr. Doyle was attacked. Why would Alexandra be paying him for a security contract? Ethan asked. It's vague on purpose, Marshall said, but this might be the connection we need. The discovery reignited the investigation. Over the next few days, Marshall's team worked tirelessly to track down Cameron Tate. Meanwhile, the Parkers resumed their work on the Brave Voices Foundation, determined not to let the past overshadow their new mission. One evening, as Lily helped organize files for the foundation, she overheard her parents talking in the next room. Do you think we'll ever feel normal again? Grace asked. I don't know, Ethan admitted, but I do know this. We're stronger now than we've ever been. And that's because of Lily. She saved us. Lily smiled to herself, their words a reminder of how far they had come. Just as the Parkers began to find their footing, a call came from Marshall. We found Cameron Tate, he said. Where is he? Ethan asked, gripping the phone tightly. He's staying at a motel on the edge of town, Marshall replied. But there's a problem. He's refusing to talk to anyone but Lily. Grace's heart sank. Absolutely not. She's just a child. I agree, Marshall said. But Tate was insistent. He says he has information that could change everything. Ethan and Grace exchanged a worried glance. No, Grace said firmly. I won't let Lily be put in danger again. But Lily, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Mom, I can do this. Grace shook her head. Lily, no. It's too risky. If Cameron knows something that could help other people, we can't ignore it, Lily said. I'll be safe. Detective Marshall will be there. After a long, tense discussion, Grace finally relented. If anything happens to her, nothing will, Marshall promised. The next morning, Lily and Marshall arrived at the motel. Cameron Tate was waiting in a dimly lit room, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. You're the kid, he said, his voice rough. The one who stood up to Shaw. Yes, Lily said, her voice steady. What do you know? Tate hesitated, then handed her a small envelope. This is what you're looking for. It's everything Alexandra didn't want anyone to know. Lily opened the envelope to find a USB drive inside. What's on this? Marshall asked. Records, emails, blackmail material, Tate said. It's enough to expose people even bigger than Shaw. She wasn't the top of the pyramid. She was just a piece of it. Marshall's jaw tightened. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Tate laughed bitterly. Do you know what they do to people who talk? I only came to you because they're watching me. If I disappear, you'll know why. As they left the motel, Marshall held the USB drive tightly. This could blow everything wide open, he said. But if Alexandra wasn't the top, Lily said, then who is? Marshall didn't answer, but the question hung heavy in the air. That night, as the Parkers sat together, Marshall called with an update. The data on the USB drive is massive, he said. We're still going through it, but there's one name that keeps coming up, Joseph Wexler. Who's that? Grace asked. A powerful CEO with deep political ties, Marshall said. If what Tate gave us is true, Wexler might be the real mastermind behind all of this. The room fell silent as the enormity of the situation sank in. The Parkers had thought their battle was over, but it seemed the shadows of Alexandra Shaw's empire stretched farther than they could have imagined. As Lily looked out the window, the faint glow of the city lights in the distance, she felt a mixture of fear and resolve. The truth isn't always what it seems, she whispered, but we'll find it. The revelation of Joseph Wexler's name sent shockwaves through Detective Marshall's team. Wexler was a corporate titan, known for his philanthropic endeavors and political influence. On the surface, he was untouchable, a man who had built a reputation of integrity. But the data on Cameron Tate's USB drive painted a far darker picture. This isn't just about money, Marshall said during a meeting with Grace, Ethan, and Lily. Wexler has been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. He's funded illegal operations, silenced whistleblowers, and used people like Alexandra Shaw to carry out his dirty work. So Alexandra wasn't the mastermind? Grace asked. No, Marshall replied. She was a lieutenant in a much bigger operation. Wexler kept his hands clean by staying in the shadows, but his name is all over these documents. That evening, Back at the Parker home, Lily couldn't stop thinking about Wexler. She sat at the kitchen table with her journal, writing down everything they'd learned. "He's like a spider," she murmured, "sitting in the middle of a web, controlling everything." Ethan sat down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've done so much already, Lily. You don't have to carry this." "But what if he's planning something worse?" Lily asked, looking up at her dad. "What if we're the only ones who can stop him?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Then we'll do whatever it takes. Together." The next day, Marshall's team began building their case against Wexler. The USB drive contained incriminating emails, financial records, and detailed plans for operations that stretched across multiple states. But prosecuting someone as powerful as Wexler wouldn't be easy. This kind of case could take years, Marshall told the Parkers during a briefing. "We need a direct link between Wexler and Alexandra Shaw's crimes, something undeniable." "What about Cameron Tate?" Grace asked. "He's a key witness," Marshall said, "but he's terrified. Wexler's people are already looking for him." "Then he needs protection," Ethan said firmly. "We're working on it," Marshall assured them. "But there's another problem. Wexler knows we're closing in. He'll do everything in his power to destroy the evidence and discredit us." That night, Lily was awakened by a noise outside her window. She peeked through the curtains and saw a black car idling at the curb. Her heart raced as she watched a figure step out and place something in the mailbox before quickly driving away. "Mom, Dad," Lily called, rushing down the hall. Grace and Ethan hurried to the front door, where they found an envelope stuffed in the mailbox. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of Wexler shaking hands with Alexandra Shaw at a fundraiser. Scrawled across the back were the words, "Watch your back." Marshall arrived shortly after to examine the photograph. "This is a message," he said, his jaw tight. "Wexler knows you're involved, and he's trying to intimidate you." Grace folded her arms, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Well, it's not going to work." Lily, standing nearby, spoke up. "What if the photo is more than a warning? What if it's a clue?" Marshall studied the image again. "It's possible. This fundraiser was held 5 years ago at Wexler's estate. If Shaw and Wexler were working together back then, there might be more evidence connected to that event." The next morning, Marshall's team obtained a warrant to search Wexler's private archives. The estate was sprawling, with guards stationed at every entrance. Marshall coordinated with his team to ensure the operation was swift and discreet. Inside the estate, the team uncovered a hidden room behind a false wall in Wexler's study. The room was filled with filing cabinets, hard drives, and surveillance footage dating back years. "This is it," Marshall said, his adrenaline surging. "The smoking gun." As the evidence was transported to the station, Wexler's lawyers were already on the offensive. They filed motions to suppress the evidence, claiming the search was unlawful. Meanwhile, Wexler himself appeared on national television, portraying himself as a victim of a smear campaign. "This is nothing more than an attempt to tarnish my reputation," he said during a live interview. "I have devoted my life to helping others, and I will not be intimidated by baseless accusations." The public was divided. While some believed the evidence against Wexler, others bought into his narrative of innocence. The Parkers watched the interview from their living room, frustration boiling over. "How can people believe him?" Ethan asked, pacing the room. "Because people like him are good at lying," Grace said. Lily, sitting cross-legged on the couch, stared at the screen. "He's scared," she said softly. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, pausing. "He wouldn't be on TV if he wasn't worried," Lily said. "He knows the evidence is real, and he's trying to make people doubt it." Grace nodded. "She's right. And the more we push, the more desperate he'll become." Over the next week, the case against Wexler gained momentum. The hidden room contained damning evidence, including a recorded phone call between Wexler and Shaw discussing the attack on Mr. Doyle. "We've got him," Marshall told the Parkers during a late-night meeting. "This recording ties him directly to everything. Once we play this in court, there's no way he can deny it." But Wexler wasn't going down without a fight. The night before the trial was set to begin, Marshall received a tip that Wexler had hired a private security team to destroy key evidence. "He's planning something big," Marshall said, gathering his team. We need to move now. The chapter ends with Marshall, the Parkers, and a team of officers preparing for a high-stakes operation to secure the evidence and ensure it reaches the courtroom. As they move out, Lily watches from the window, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. "We're so close," she whispered. "We can't let him win." The tension was suffocating as Detective Marshall and his team finalized preparations for their operation. The evidence they had gathered against Joseph Wexler was damning, but Wexler's attempts to destroy key records meant they had no time to waste. Ethan and Grace stood in the station's conference room, their faces etched with worry. Lily sat nearby, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm and her journal open in front of her. "You're sure it's all there?" Ethan asked Marshall. "Every piece," Marshall replied. "The ledgers, the USB drive, the recording of Wexler's phone call with Shaw. It's enough to bring him down, but only if we keep it safe." "Do you think he'll try to stop you?" Grace asked. Marshall nodded. "He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." That night, the operation began. The evidence was transported in an armored vehicle escorted by a convoy of police cars. Marshall coordinated every step, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Inside the armored vehicle, 2 officers sat with the evidence, their eyes scanning the road for any signs of trouble. Meanwhile, Wexler watched the convoy on a live feed from a private room in his estate. "They've got everything," one of his hired men said. Wexler's face was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. "Then make sure they never make it to court." The convoy moved through the city, the tension growing with every mile. Suddenly, a black SUV sped out of a side street, cutting off one of the escort vehicles. "Ambush!" one of the officers shouted as more SUVs appeared, surrounding the convoy. Marshall, driving in the lead car, slammed on the brakes and grabbed his radio. "All units, we're under attack. Hold your positions and protect the evidence." The officers sprang into action, engaging the attackers in a tense standoff. Lily, watching the chaos unfold on a live news feed at the station, clutched her rabbit tightly. "Mom, they're trying to stop them," she whispered. Grace knelt beside her, holding her close. "They'll be okay. Marshall knows what he's doing." The attackers were well equipped, but Marshall's team held their ground. Using tear gas and tactical maneuvers, the officers managed to neutralize the threat and secure the evidence. Marshall approached one of the captured attackers, pulling off his mask. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The man smirked. "You know who." "Wexler," Marshall muttered under his breath. The evidence was safely delivered to the courthouse under heavy guard. Marshall immediately notified Grace and Ethan. "We got it there," he said. "Wexler's plan failed." Ethan let out a breath of relief. Now it's up to the court. The trial began the next day, with the courtroom packed to capacity. Reporters, community members, and even Wexler's former associates filled the seats, eager to see the once untouchable businessman face justice. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the evidence. This USB drive contains financial records that directly tie Joseph Wexler to Alexandra Shaw's criminal operations, the prosecutor said, holding up the device. And this recording captures a conversation in which Wexler instructs Shaw to take care of Mr. Doyle, a clear reference to the attack that nearly cost him his life. The recording played for the jury, Wexler's calm voice chilling in its precision. "Handle it quietly. I don't want anything traced back to me." Wexler's defense attorney tried to discredit the evidence, arguing that the USB drive could have been tampered with and that the recording lacked context. But the prosecution was prepared. They called Cameron Tate to the stand, his testimony painting a damning picture of Wexler's operations. "Wexler orchestrated everything," Tate said. "Shaw, Langley, the ledgers, it all led back to him. He controlled it all from behind the scenes." When asked why he came forward, Tate's voice faltered. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore. People got hurt. Families were destroyed. It had to stop." As the trial reached its climax, Wexler himself took the stand. Calm and composed, he denied all allegations, portraying himself as a victim of a smear campaign. "This is nothing more than an attempt to ruin my reputation," Wexler said. "I have spent my life helping others, and I refuse to let baseless accusations destroy everything I've built." The jury watched intently, their expressions unreadable. The Parkers sat together in the gallery, Lily clutching her rabbit tightly. When the prosecutor delivered the closing argument, she leaned forward, her heart pounding. Joseph Wexler built an empire on lies, manipulation, and fear, the prosecutor said. But today, we have the opportunity to hold him accountable. The evidence is clear, and the truth is undeniable. Justice must be served. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the case pressing heavily on everyone. When they finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. In the case of the state versus Joseph Wexler, the foreperson began. We find the defendant guilty on all charges. The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps. Wexler's calm demeanor cracked for the first time as he was led away in handcuffs, his empire finally dismantled. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the Parkers, eager for their reaction. "What's next for your family?" one journalist asked. Grace smiled, holding Lily close. "We're going to focus on rebuilding our lives and helping others. That's what matters now." Lily, her eyes shining with determination, added, "No one should have to go through what we did. That's why we're going to keep fighting for what's right." In the weeks that followed, the Brave Voices Foundation gained national attention, inspiring families across the country to stand up against injustice. Lily became a symbol of courage, proving that even the smallest voices could make a difference. One evening, as the family sat on the porch, Ethan turned to Lily. "You know," he said, "you taught us all something important." "What's that?" Lily asked. "That the truth matters," Ethan said. "And no matter how hard it is to find, it's always worth fighting for." Lily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We found it, didn't we?" "Yes," Grace said, wrapping her arms around her family. "And we'll keep finding it, for ourselves and for others." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, the Parkers knew that their journey wasn't over. But together, they were ready for whatever came next.